Well, the rest of the book of Hosea is poetry. Here's a tip on how to read poetry. In stories, you've got a problem and you track along to see how the problem is resolved. That's how narrative works. In the Bible's letters, you've got arguments and they're carefully defended. In poems, though, you have images and they're mashed together to make you feel things. So as you read these poems, two questions to ask. What does it mean? That's the question we always ask. But also this question, how are you meant to feel about it? How are you meant to feel when you hear these images and see what it describes? And in this section, I kind of think you're meant to feel a bit sickened, maybe a bit revolted, as you see the way that God has been treated. When we last left Hosea, he'd brought his wife back from prostitution as an image of how God loves his people, even though they've rejected him again and again. God's love for his people is relentless, we've seen again and again. But if we slipped into thinking that God was this always accommodating husband who will put up with literally anything, that belief is shattered in the rest of the book. Because here, like a judge in a courtroom reading out the case against a convicted criminal, God brings his charge against Israel, his charge against those who live in the land. And here's his charge. He says there is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. They're not faithful, they're not trustworthy with God, and so they're not faithful with each other. Instead, there's cursing, lying, murder, stealing, and adultery. They lie and steal. They don't love God, and so they don't love each other. There's cursing and adultery and murder. Now, I don't think these are just metaphors. I think this is what's literally happening in the land of Israel. This society is totally falling apart. And what happens when humans are accused of doing wrong? What happens when you get accused of doing wrong? What happens whenever anybody's accused of doing wrong? Well, we try and blame somebody else, and that's what they want to do in verse 4. They say, but let no one bring a charge, let no one accuse another, because what are they doing? They want to bring a charge against God or a charge against somebody else. It was somebody else. It was my parents. It was my environment. I wasn't raised right, but God won't have any of that. In fact, he singles out the priests in verse 6. Have a look, verse 6. He says, you have rejected knowledge, so I also reject you as my priests. It's the priests that he singles out, because in the Old Testament, priests had three jobs. They were meant to teach the Old Testament law. They were meant to do all the sacrifices in the temple to pay for people's sin, and they were meant to pray for the people. But what have these priests done? They've rejected knowledge of God. They've rejected knowledge, and they've ignored the law of God. That's what they've done. Verse 7, they exchanged their glorious God for something disgraceful. They've exchanged God for worshipping fake gods. At verse 8, the priests are so messed up that they actually love it when Israel sin. They feed on the sins of my people and relish their wickedness. The very people who are meant to keep Israel from sinning, sin themselves and approve when people join in. And so God judges the priests and he judges the people who follow them. It will be like people, like priests. I will punish both of them for their ways and repay them for their deeds, verse 9 says. And the root cause of all of this evil is that they don't know God. And you see that all through this passage. We come back to verse 6. You stumble day and night. My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge because you have rejected knowledge. Now in the Bible, knowing is not simply about facts, but about relationship. It's the same thing in English too. There's a big difference between knowing a celebrity because you know facts about them or you met them once, and knowing a celebrity because you're a really close friend of them. Now Israel don't know their God. They don't have a deep relationship with God because they've rejected him in favor of these fake gods. Israel don't know God because they don't want to know God. They don't think God matters. And sadly, nothing's changed. You get to the New Testament and hear these chilling words from God as he assesses humans. This is Romans 1, verse 18. It says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. They did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God. They don't think it's worth knowing God. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. They not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. People in Israel rejected God. People today reject God. Nothing's changed. Except for Christians, it has changed. Because of John 1. Remember what it says? No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. We actually know God in the deepest way through Jesus. So for Christians, Galatians 4, formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not God, but now you know God. As Christians, we actually know God now. So let's not decide, like Israel, that there's something more important to know than God. And let's not, like Israel, confuse knowing about God with actually knowing God. That's our challenge.